1985 broke the American heartland. Foreclosure signs sprouted faster than winter wheat, and a massive price collapse pushed generations of farmers to the brink. While neighbors auctioned their legacies for pennies, one desperate Nebraska woman gambled her family's entire future on a rusted, forgotten monstrosity bolted together 22 years earlier. September wines usually carried the sweet promise of harvest across Otto County, Nebraska, but in the fall of 1985, they only brought the bitter sting of ruin. The American farm crisis had reached a fever pitch. Grain embargoes, skyrocketing interest rates, and a devastating surplus had driven the price of wheat down to a catastrophic $2.12 a bushel. It cost nearly $3 just to grow it. Across the Midwest, the mathematics of survival had shattered, leaving a trail of shattered families, padlocked barns, and generations of pride sold off to the highest bidder at county auctions. Blanca Young sat rigid in the stifling wood-paneled office of the First National Bank, her calloused hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the mahogany desk sat Arthur Pendleton, a loan officer whose sympathetic smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Pendleton slid a thick manila folder across the desk. The red ink on the ledger pages seemed to bleed into the paper. "It's just math, Blanca," Arthur said softly, tapping a gold pen against the file. "Your operating loan is 90 days past due. Interest rates are sitting at 18%. Even if you pull a record yield off your 600 acres this spring, at current wheat prices, you'll barely cover the fuel it takes to run your tractors. The bank cannot extend your credit line for another planting season." Blanca stared at the foreclosure notice tucked neatly beneath her father's signature from a decade prior. The Young farm had survived the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and 2 world wars. Now it was being quietly executed by a man in a tailored suit, wielding a pocket calculator. "I have the seed," Blanca replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I just need the diesel money to plow and plant. Give me one more season, Arthur. The market has to correct." "The market isn't correcting, Blanca. It's collapsing," Arthur sighed, leaning back. "Look out the window. Talon Grisham just bought the old Miller place for 40 cents on the dollar. He has the capital to weather this. He's already made a generous offer to assume your debt if you sign the deed over to him today. You walk away with nothing, but you walk away clean. No sheriff's deputies at your door. No public embarrassment." The mention of Talon Grisham made Blanca's jaw clench. Grisham was a corporate farmer, a man who viewed topsoil as a spreadsheet variable and neighbors as mere obstacles to expansion. He had been circling the Young land like a vulture for 3 years. "My grandfather broke that sod with a team of mules," Blanca said, standing up, the leather chair groaning beneath her. "I'm not signing it over to Grisham so he can bulldoze the farmhouse and add it to his empire. I'll find a way to plant. Without diesel to pull your plows, you can't prepare the seed bed," Arthur warned, dropping the gold pen. "And without an operating loan, you have no diesel. If there's no crop in the ground by November 1st, the bank seizes the property. I'm sorry, Blanca." She walked out of the bank and into the harsh autumn sunlight. The drive back to the farm was an agonizing tour of a dying community. Hand-painted auction signs hammered into fence posts lined the dirt roads. Tractors that had once been the pride of local families were lined up in muddy fields, waiting to be liquidated. When Blanca pulled her battered Ford pickup into the gravel driveway of her farm, the silence of the property was deafening. Her father had passed away 2 years prior, leaving her to run the operation alone. She walked out to the edge of the home quarter, kneeling in the dirt. The traditional method of farming required a brutal, fuel-heavy process. Plowing the field deep to turn over the soil, disking it twice to break up the clods, and then dragging a planter across the bare earth. It took thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, fuel she could no longer afford to buy. To save the farm, she needed a miracle. She needed a way to put wheat into the ground without turning the soil. She needed to cut her operating costs by 70%, a feat every agronomist in the state deemed biologically and mechanically impossible. That night, unable to sleep, Blanca wandered into the sprawling corrugated steel machine shed at the edge of the property. It was a graveyard of broken equipment and forgotten projects, smelling heavily of mouse droppings, ancient grease, and rust. In the very back, hidden beneath a heavy canvas tarp that hadn't been moved in 2 decades, sat a machine that had been the laughingstock of Odo County. Blanca grabbed the corner of the stiff, dust-caked tarp and pulled. The machine looked like a mechanical Frankenstein, a hulking, rusted monstrosity forged from salvaged steel and sheer stubbornness. It was a prototype built in the winter of 1963 by Blanca's late uncle, Walter Higgins, a brilliant but eccentric mechanic who had a dangerous habit of challenging conventional wisdom. Uncle Walter had possessed a radical idea long before his time. He believed that traditional plowing was destroying the soil's moisture and causing erosion. He envisioned a machine heavy and sharp enough to slice directly through the tough residue of the previous year's harvest, drop a seed into the narrow slit, and press it firmly shut, all in a single pass. Today, the concept is known as no-till farming, but in 1963, it was considered absolute madness. Blanca ran her hand over the massive serrated steel coulter blades mounted to the heavy tubular frame. Walter had spent his life savings building it. He had dragged it into the field in the spring of '64, attempting to plant directly into the hard, unplowed earth. Mechanically, the machine had worked, but agriculturally, it was a disaster. Because Walter hadn't plowed to kill the existing weeds, the new crop was immediately choked out by invasive vegetation. Without modern herbicides to clear the field first, Walter's experiment yielded a devastating crop failure. The bank nearly took the farm then, and Walter, humiliated and broken, parked the massive planter in the back of the shed, threw a tarp over it, and never spoke of it again. But as Blanca stared at the rusted press wheels, in the dim light of 1985, a radical, dangerous realization washed over her. Uncle Walter hadn't been wrong. He had just been 20 years too early. In the decades since 1963, agricultural chemical companies had developed new, relatively affordable, broad-spectrum herbicides. A farmer could now spray a field to kill the weeds without ever having to turn the soil with a plow. If she could use a cheap chemical burn down to clear the field, all she needed was a machine capable of slicing through the hard, untilled earth to plant the seed. If Walter's machine could be resurrected, Blanca wouldn't need to plow. She wouldn't need to disc. She would reduce her tractor passes across the field from 4 down to just 1. The few $100s she had left in her personal savings could buy enough diesel for a single pass, saving her thousands and bypassing Arthur Pendleton's financial death sentence. The next morning, Blanca drove to the outskirts of town to a struggling auto repair shop. Beneath a rusted Chevy truck lay Henry Fisher, a brilliant, foul-mouthed mechanic who had apprenticed under Uncle Walter in the '60s. Henry's business was failing just as fast as the local farms. A community with no money couldn't afford to fix its cars. "You're out of your mind, B.A., Henry said, wiping grease from his forehead with a ragged shop towel after she pitched her idea. "I helped Walter weld that monstrosity together. It weighs 6 tons empty. The hydraulic cylinders on that thing have been seizing up since the Kennedy administration. Even if I could get the seed flutes to turn, the ground out there is baked hard as concrete from the dry summer. Those old coulter blades will snap right off the frame." "The blades are forged from high-carbon steel, Henry," Blanca countered, slapping a heavily folded blueprint on his workbench. It was Walter's original schematic, stained with coffee and oil. "I know they'll hold. I have 3 weeks before the planting window closes completely. If I don't get seed in the ground, Grisham gets my farm. If you help me rebuild it, I'll sign over the title to my father's 1968 Mustang sitting in my garage. You can sell it in Omaha and save your shop." Henry stared at her, then down at the faded blueprints of his old mentor. He owed Walter Higgins his livelihood, and he despised Talon Grisham just as much as Blanca did. "You buy the welding wire and the hydraulic fluid," Henry muttered, "and I don't want to hear a word when this thing falls apart in the dirt." For the next 2 weeks, the young farm became a clandestine manufacturing plant. Blanca and Henry worked in the dead of night to keep their project hidden from the prying eyes of neighbors. Sparks rained down from the rafters as Henry cut away the rusted mounts, replacing them with salvaged steel from scrapped tractors. Blanca spent days painstakingly dismantling the rusted seed meters, soaking the delicate gears in diesel fuel, and scrubbing them with a wire brush until they spun freely. They replaced the rotted rubber hydraulic hoses and rebuilt the heavy, downward pressure springs that would force the slicing blades into the unyielding earth. It was grueling, brutal work. Blanca's knuckles were constantly bleeding, her muscles screaming from hefting cast iron parts into place. Word inevitably leaked out. Small towns have no secrets, especially when desperate people start behaving strangely. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon, a brand-new, air-conditioned pickup truck rolled up the driveway. Talon Grisham stepped out, wearing a pristine cowboy hat and a smug smile. He strolled into the machine shed uninvited, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw the towering, scarred metal beast Henry was welding. "I heard a rumor you were losing your grip on reality, Blanca, but I didn't think you were building a scrap metal sculpture." Grisham laughed, kicking one of the heavy gauge wheels with the toe of his polished boot. "Arthur Pendleton tells me you didn't secure your loan. You're out of fuel, B. You can't plant with this. Whatever it is. It's over. Sell to me now, and I'll give you enough cash to move to the city and start over." Blanca stepped out from behind the planter, a heavy wrench gripped tightly in her hand. Her face was smudged with grease, her eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering defiance. "Get off my land, Talon." "Suit yourself," Grisham sneered, backing away. "The deadline is November 1st. When the sheriff locks your gate, I'll buy this farm at auction for half of what I'm offering you today. And the first thing I'm going to do is drag that piece of junk to the scrapyard." By the final week of October, the machine was finished. It looked terrifying, a jagged, brutal array of sharp steel discs, heavy springs, and iron press wheels hitched to the back of Blanca's aging tractor. But the weather had taken a severe turn. A massive early-season cold front was barreling down from Canada, threatening to freeze the ground solid. On the morning of the test run, the sky was a bruised, menacing purple. The wind howled across the plains, rattling the corrugated walls of the shed. Henry hooked up the final hydraulic line, his hands numb from the cold. "This is it, B," Henry yelled over the roar of the tractor's diesel engine. "Once you drop those blades into the dirt, the down pressure is going to fight the tractor. If the frame has a weak weld, or if those old 1963 bearings seize up, the whole planter is going to tear itself apart." Blanca climbed into the cab of the tractor, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She engaged the power takeoff, gripping the hydraulic lever that would lower the massive planter to the earth. She looked out over the barren, unplowed field of her ancestors. The future of the young farm, the legacy of her father, and the vindication of a brilliant, forgotten uncle, all rested on this single, desperate gamble. She slammed the lever forward. Steel shrieked against the frozen Nebraska topsoil. The 6-ton planter violently slammed downward, the immense weight transferring directly onto the sharp, serrated coulter blades. Blanca's old John Deere tractor reared up slightly, its front tires floating inches off the ground, before crashing back down with a heavy thud. Black diesel smoke belched from the exhaust stack in a thick, choking cloud as the engine bogged down, screaming against the sudden, massive resistance of the unyielding earth. Blanca gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned entirely white. The tractor crawled forward at an agonizingly slow pace. Behind her, the rusted mechanical beast groaned, but it did exactly what Uncle Walter had designed it to do. The heavy steel blades sliced a razor-thin slit through the hardened residue of the previous year's crop. The refurbished seed flutes dropped a steady stream of winter wheat directly into the newly opened earth, and the heavy cast-iron press wheels rolled over the trench, sealing it tightly shut. Henry Fisher sprinted alongside the moving contraption, dodging the massive tires. He dropped to his knees in the wake of the planter, furiously digging his bare fingers into the freezing soil. He pulled out a single, perfectly placed wheat seed, holding it up like a precious diamond. "It's in," Henry bellowed over the roar of the diesel engine, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Depth is exactly 2 inches. The press wheels are closing the furrow. B, it's actually working. Relief washed over Blanca. But it was fleeting. Proving the machine worked was only the first battle. She had exactly 4 days to plant 600 acres before the November 1st deadline set by the bank. Running at a top speed of barely 4 miles an hour, she would have to drive day and night without stopping. The first 48 hours blurred into a hallucination of diesel fumes, vibrating floorboards, and a blinding barrage of tractor headlights piercing the frigid night. Blanca survived on lukewarm black coffee from a thermos and sheer, unadulterated adrenaline. She watched the fuel gauge with a hawk's intensity. Because she wasn't dragging a massive plow to turn the soil over, the fuel consumption was a fraction of what a traditional planting required. The math was holding up. Uncle Walter's mad science was saving the farm. On the evening of October 29th, the temperature plummeted to 15 degrees and disaster struck. A horrific sound, like a cannon shot, echoed across the barren plains. The tractor violently lurched sideways, violently throwing Blanca against the side of the cab. She slammed the clutch and ripped the power takeoff lever backward, killing the machinery instantly. The sudden silence in the field was deafening, broken only by the whistling wind and the ticking of the overheated engine. Blanca grabbed a flashlight and scrambled out of the cab, her heart sinking into her stomach. Henry had warned her about the sheer physical stress the machine would endure. He had been right. The main toolbar, a thick, load-bearing square of steel that held the center-slicing blades, had completely snapped in half. The weld Henry had applied held perfectly, but the brittle, 22-year-old metal around it had sheared under the immense downward pressure of the frozen ground. The right side of the planter sagged uselessly into the dirt, an amputated limb bleeding hydraulic fluid into the soil. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. She had roughly 150 acres left to plant. It was 9 o'clock at night. In less than 48 hours, Arthur Pendleton and Talon Grisham would arrive with the county sheriff to padlock her gates. Blanca ran all the way back to the farmhouse and frantically dialed Henry's number on the rotary phone. When the mechanic arrived in his battered truck 30 minutes later, he took one look at the fractured steel and angrily threw his wrench into the dirt. "It's over, B," Henry said softly, rubbing his freezing face. "I can't weld cast iron out here in this wind. The ambient temperature is too low. The moment the welding torch hits that frozen metal, the thermal shock will shatter the entire frame, like a glass window. We'd have to haul it all the way back to my shop, heat the whole beam with an acetylene torch for hours, and weld it indoors. Taking this thing apart and moving it will take 3 days." "We are not taking it apart," Blanca said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. "We build a shop right here, in the dirt." Henry stared at her, as if she had lost her mind. But Blanca was already moving. She drove her pickup truck out to the field, positioning it directly next to the broken planter. From the barn, she dragged out heavy canvas tarps, thick moving blankets, and every space heater she owned. Together they built a makeshift tent over the broken section of the planter, tying the tarps to the truck and the tractor to block the howling wind. Blanca brought out bags of charcoal from her barbecue grill and a portable generator. They piled the glowing coals directly underneath the broken steel beam inside the tent, using Blanca's hairdryer to fan the flames into a makeshift forge. Slowly, agonizingly, the ambient temperature inside the canvas enclosure began to rise. The frozen metal began to sweat, and then, after 2 hours, it grew warm to the touch. At 2 in the morning, under the flickering orange glow of the charcoal fire, Henry donned his welding mask. The crackle of the welding arc illuminated the desperate, grease-stained faces of the farmer and the mechanic. Sparks cascaded over the frozen ground. Henry laid bead after bead of molten steel into the fracture, reinforcing the joint with thick plates of scrap iron scavenged from the truck bed. They left the coals burning until dawn to ensure the metal cooled slowly and evenly, preventing it from cracking again. By sunrise on October 30th, Blanca was back in the driver's seat. The weld held. For the final 30 hours, Blanca pushed the tractor past its breaking point. She ignored her bleeding hands, the aching in her spine, and the exhaustion clouding her vision. She drove through a biting, early-season snow squall, the headlights illuminating a hypnotic swirl of white flakes. At 11:45 p.m. on October 31st, Blanca pulled the hydraulic lever backward. The towering planter lifted out of the soil for the final time. The field was finished. Every single acre was planted. She shut off the engine, slumped forward against the steering wheel, and finally allowed herself to sleep. Morning broke with a harsh, glaring light bouncing off a thin layer of frost. A sleek, black Lincoln Town car crunched its way up the young gravel driveway. Arthur Pendleton stepped out, carrying his leather briefcase tight against his chest. Behind him, Talon Grisham pulled up in his pristine pickup truck, practically vibrating with eager anticipation. Blanca was sitting on the front porch, drinking a steaming cup of coffee. She didn't stand up when they approached. "It's a tragic day, Blanca," Pendleton said, refusing to meet her eyes. "But the deadline has passed. I need you to sign the foreclosure acknowledgement." Talon has his crew ready to move in and start winterizing the property. Grisham smirked, looking out over the home quarter. His smile suddenly vanished. He frowned, stepping off the porch and walking toward the edge of the field. He expected to see the deep, dark furrows of plowed earth. Instead, the field looked completely untouched, covered in the dead, pale yellow stubble of last year's harvest. "You didn't plant," Grisham said, turning back to her with a look of triumphant disgust. "You didn't even plow. You just gave up." "Check the contract, Arthur," Blanca said, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "The provision states that if a winter crop is physically in the ground by November 1st, the operating loan is automatically rolled over against the future harvest yield. No foreclosure can be initiated on a seeded field." "There is no seed in that dirt," Grisham shouted, marching into the field. He kicked at the hard ground with his polished boot. Blanca stood up, walked into the field, and knelt right where Grisham was standing. She brushed away a light dusting of frost, revealing a perfectly straight, razor-thin slit cut into the earth. She dug her fingers in, pulled out a firm, planted wheat seed, and held it up to the morning sun. 600 acres, Blanca said coldly. "Planted at 2 inches depth. The bank's contract says nothing about how I plant, only that I do. The crop is in, Arthur. Get off my farm." Pendleton crouched down, examining the slit in the earth with wide-eyed disbelief. He checked another spot 10 feet away. More seed. He stood up, nervously adjusting his tie, and looked at Grisham. "She's right, Talon. Legally, the foreclosure is paused until harvest. There's nothing I can do." Grisham's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. He glared at Blanca, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you're clever, B? You plant it into hardpan. The ground is too tight, the roots will never spread, and the weeds will choke out whatever manages to sprout. You haven't saved your farm. You've just delayed your funeral until June." Grisham stormed back to his truck and sped off, throwing gravel into the crisp morning air. Winter blanketed Nebraska in snow, but when the spring of 1986 arrived, it brought a devastating twist to the Midwestern agricultural landscape. A severe, relentless, dry spell gripped the region. For 2 months, not a single drop of rain fell on Otto County. The traditional farmers, including Talon Grisham, watched in absolute horror as their aggressively plowed fields dried out completely. Because they had turned the soil over, breaking up its structure and exposing it to the air, the ferocious spring winds picked up the loose, dry topsoil and blew it away in massive, blinding clouds of dust. Grisham's seeds were left exposed, dying in the harsh sun before they could establish roots. But on the young farm, a miracle of science and stubbornness was unfolding. Because Blanca had never plowed the field, the thick residue of the previous year's harvest remained acting like a protective blanket over the earth. It shaded the ground from the baking sun and blocked the fierce winds. More importantly, that layer of organic matter trapped the winter moisture deep in the soil, locking it exactly where the new seeds needed it. By late May, while Gresham's massive corporate fields were barren, cracked, and blowing away, Blanca's 600 acres erupted into a vibrant, brilliant sea of emerald green. The roots had easily navigated the slit cut by Uncle Walter's heavy blades, thriving in the moisture-rich, undisturbed soil beneath the surface. Harvest time in July brought a parade of local farmers to the edge of Blanca's property. They parked their trucks on the shoulder of the road, staring in awe at the massive combine rolling through the densest, tallest stand of wheat anyone had seen in a decade. The yield monitor in the combine cabin displayed numbers that defied belief: 68 bushels an acre. It was a record-breaking crop during one of the worst local droughts in recent memory. Furthermore, because the drought had decimated the yields of corporate operations like Gresham's across the state, the localized shortage caused wheat prices at the regional elevators to spike dramatically. Blanca didn't just survive, she capitalized. In August, she walked into the First National Bank. She completely ignored Arthur Pendleton. Walking directly into the branch manager's office, she dropped a cashier's check on the desk that paid off her father's operating loan in its entirety, cleared the overdue interest, and left her with enough capital to fully fund the next 3 planting seasons. Talon Gresham, heavily over-leveraged on expensive land and devastated by his failed crops, was forced to liquidate half of his holdings just to avoid bankruptcy. His empire crumbled into the very topsoil he had aggressively abused. The rusted, imposing monstrosity, built by Uncle Walter Higgins, was never hidden beneath a tarp again. Instead, Henry Fisher was commissioned by dozens of local farmers to build replicas of the heavy Coulter system. Blanca Young had not only saved her family's legacy, but she had also inadvertently sparked a localized agricultural revolution. She proved that the old, destructive ways of breaking the earth weren't the only path to survival. Sometimes, salvation requires looking back into the shadows of a barn, pulling the tarp off forgotten brilliance, and having the sheer courage to bet everything on a single, desperate pass through the unyielding ground. If this incredible story of resilience and defiance against all odds moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a true underdog triumph. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more hidden, unbelievable historical stories just like this one. Blanca's fight proves that innovation and courage can rewrite destiny. Drop a comment below. Would you have risked it all on a rusted machine? Subscribe now, and we will see you in the next epic video.